how does Declaration of Independence capture the American mind and the vision of America?
Right. So I think the idea of America can be summed up in one sentence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, among which are the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Let me just make sure that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. This is all one sentence. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Now, that's all one sentence, right? It's the second sentence of the Declaration. And that one sentence is, it's many things. First, it's a précis of John Locke's Second Treatise of Government. Secondly, it is a summing up of the principles that the Americans had developed between, let's say, 1760 and 1776. And as Jefferson said, it's an expression of the American mind. Now, let's parse that one long sentence. I mean, contained in this one sentence is a philosophy, is a moral and political philosophy. Well, that's it. That's it. It's a moral and political philosophy. The Declaration says we hold these truths to be self-evident. Then it follows by identifying 4 self-evident truths, which can be summed up each in one word: equality, rights, consent, and revolution. Those are the 4 core ideas of the American Revolution or of the American founding. But let's step back and think about this for a second. We hold these truths to be self-evident. I think that clause is the most important and the most eloquent. Those are the most eloquent 7 words in American history. Parse that one clause. We hold these truths to be self-evident. Well, who is the we? Who does the we represent and we hold these truths to be self-evident? The Declaration of Independence was largely written by Thomas Jefferson, but it was edited and approved by a committee of 5, which included Ben Franklin and John Adams. But it can't, the we can't be just the drafting committee of the Declaration. It also has to include every person who signed the Declaration of Independence, right? So at the very least, the we, and we hold these truths, is the Continental Congress, which passed and signed the Declaration of Independence. But the Declaration, if it is an expression of the American mind, the we must also include not just the Continental Congress, but it really has to include the American people. But then you have to ask yourself the question, well, what does it mean to say that these truths are self-evident? Are they really self-evident? Is the revolution truth, the 4th truth, is that self-evident? I don't think it is. So what does it mean to say that we hold these truths to be self-evident? What would it mean to say that a farmer living, an uneducated, hardscrabble farmer living on the western frontier of Massachusetts, knows what self-evident truth, knows what self-evident even means, right? And so, what does self-evident even mean? A self-evident truth, as it was understood in the 17th and 18th centuries, it was a proposition where the predicate and the subject necessarily related to one another without contradiction. Like, up is not down, black is not white, in is not out, et cetera, et cetera. But that's not what these four truths are. They're not self-evident in that sense. I think what self-evident means is that they could be grasped not just by the framers of the authors of the Declaration and the signers of the Declaration, but these truths could be grasped by all American people. But the single most important word in that clause is truth. We hold these truths to be self-evident. And I think that's important because certainly in the context of the 21st century, don't forget, it is said that we live in a post-truth society. Time magazine or Newsweek, I don't know, maybe a decade ago, ran a front cover which said "Truth is dead." Like, in 21st century America, we believe that Americans, or I should say, the hoity-toity intellectual class, believes that truth is subjective. That's not how American revolutionaries understood the concept truth. Truth was something that was absolute, certain, permanent, and universal. And so the concept of truth is at the heart of the Declaration of Independence. So we hold these truths to be self-evident. That is, we Americans, we hold the following four truths to be, we grasp their meaning, is what I think the Declaration is saying in its first clause. Now, should we go through the four self-evident
Yes,
truths?
please. Yeah, yes. This is fantastic. This is great. So let's just look at this sentence. Please go ahead.
All right, and well, let me actually just pause for a moment and explain to everybody who's with us today that my book is organized around the Declaration of Independence. So the full title of the book is America's Revolutionary Mind, a moral history of the American Revolution and the Declaration that defined it. And what I do in the book is I use the Declaration of Independence as a kind of ideological roadmap by which to examine the American Revolution. So there are four self-evident truths in the Declaration. I devote 2 chapters to each of the 4 self-evident truths. So 2 chapters on equality, 2 on rights, 2 on consent, and 2 on revolution. And then in the 2 chapters for each one of these 4 self-evident truths, I trace the intellectual and political history of that particular truth. Let's take equality, for instance. So I trace the idea of equality or rights, usually going back to the late 17th century, usually going back to John Locke's Second Treatise of Government, where these ideas were first explicated. And then I trace the intellectual history of these 4 self-evident truths: equality, rights, consent, revolution. I trace their development as they cross the Atlantic and land on American shores, and then how they're developed intellectually, mostly intellectually, throughout the course of the 18th century. Leading to culminating, of course, in the Declaration of Independence. So that's how the book is organized. So yeah, so 2 chapters on each of the 4 self-evident truths. All right, so take the equality truth.
I just want to say one thing. I was thinking of sentences and history. I don't think that there is any other sentence that has been as influential in transforming the world as this sentence.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly right. And although I will say it has a competitor. So if that one sentence founded a nation and changed the world for the good, I can think of one sentence that changed the world for the worse. And that sentence is from each according to his ability, to each according to his need, right? Which is Marx's famous line, and of course is the principle that is the heart and soul of socialism. Um, so yeah, this sentence is, well, let me I'll explain its importance using Abraham Lincoln.
Mhm.
Abraham Lincoln once described the Declaration of Independence as the golden apple, which sits in the frame or the silver picture, which is the Constitution, right? So just imagine a picture of silver with gold apples sitting inside it, and that was for Lincoln the proper relationship between the principles of the Declaration and the institutions created by the Constitution. Right.
Absolutely. I want to say one more thing here.
Yeah.
And the way I think about it is that it is the vision of Jefferson, which is captured here. I mean, it draws upon a lot, but he's the one who actually put it together. And then there is a genius in Madison, in understanding the structures. The structure of government that will actually implement it. Madison is being again a short form for a whole bunch of people, but culminating in Madison is being the most articulate, the most deepest thinker on the structure. So it's like it's those two things together. But go ahead, sir.
Yeah. No, I think that's exactly right. So, the equality truth. What does that mean? Well, it is and always has been a contested truth. So, in the 19th century, Southern slaveholders described the equality truth as a self-evident lie. And what was the argument that it was a self-evident lie? Well, it was really a sociological observation. You look out in the world and you see that there are inequalities, right? And of course that's true. You look out in the world and there are inequalities, and you see inequalities in every society. You see inequalities in socialist countries, communist countries. And when I walk into a classroom, um, I see there's a sense in which you could say I see nothing but inequality. I see tall, short, fast, slow, strong, weak. And when I grade their papers and exams, I see brilliant and not so brilliant, right? So when we look out in the world, there are obvious inequalities. So how did Jefferson, Adams, and the rest, how did they understand the equality truth? Well, I think they understood equality through what I call species equality, by which I mean they meant that all human beings, despite having quantitative differences with regard to intelligence, speed, strength, and a host of other characteristics, they share what we might call qualitative similarities. All men have reason and free will. They may have them to different degrees, but they all have them, and it unifies them all as humans versus dogs and horses. So all men are equal in the sense, and ultimately what they meant, though, and this blends with the second self-evident truth, all men have rights. All men are equal in their right to be self-owning and self-governing. This is how I think they understood the equality truth. Now, I might as well answer the question before it's asked because it's going to be asked, and legitimately so. And that is, how did American revolutionaries reconcile the equality truth with the existence of slavery? Right? That's the $64,000 question. And it's obviously a difficult question uh, uh, for lots of different reasons. Um, Now, let me begin by saying that virtually, not even virtually, every single American revolutionary and founding father believed that slavery was a necessary evil. And the emphasis has to be on the word evil, right? So in other words, their moral evaluation of slavery is that it was morally wrong. Now, let me explain the necessary part in a moment. It's also the case that at the time of the revolution, there was a whole spectrum of views on slavery and how to deal with the problem of slavery. At one end of the spectrum, there were founding fathers like John Adams, for instance, who believed and always believed that slavery was a moral wrong and that conditions permitting it should be abolished. There was also a group of American revolutionaries like, for instance, Ben Franklin or John Jay, who had been much, who had been as much younger men living in Philadelphia or in New York City, had owned what they called at the time a house slave. That is to say, somebody who was effectively was treated as though they were a servant. But both Jay and Franklin uh, um, uh, freed their slaves. And then both Jay and Franklin became leaders in the anti-slavery movement after 1776. And then you get founding fathers like George Washington, who was born into a slave-owning family, had slaves, but then freed his slaves upon his death. Then you get to the hard cases like Jefferson and Patrick Henry, who owned slaves and never freed their slaves. So that's the hard case, and that's the one that really has to be examined most closely. Before I do that, however, let me say this, that in my view, the Declaration of Independence is probably the single greatest document in the history of the abolitionist movement, right? There would be no American abolitionist movement without the natural rights philosophy summed up in the Declaration of Independence, right? It was the great force for ending slavery. It was the inspiration of the abolitionist movement of the 1830s. Let me also say that as a result of the Declaration of Independence, there was an anti-slavery movement that started in the North. It was an anti-slavery movement not only in the North but actually in the South. And between 1776 and 1803, every northern state, either through court cases or through legislation, gradually abolished slavery. And in a place like Virginia, between 1780 and 1790, 10,000 slaves were freed. And by 1810, I think there were 100,000 slaves in the United States who had been freed. So in other words, the movement was toward freedom as a result of the principles of the Declaration of Independence. And there's more one could say, like what was done at the federal level. The Northwest Ordinance, for instance, 1786, which prevented the extension of slavery into the Northwest Territory. But the real issue, the real challenge is this: why didn't why didn't they abolish? Why didn't they just simply abolish slavery? Um, and this goes to the heart of what I call the post-emancipation problem, which is, look, it's easy for us in the 21st century to judge and condemn uh, people like Thomas Jefferson for not freeing their slaves. But they viewed the situation somewhat differently. I mean, they had a real concrete problem. And the concrete problem was how do you free 2 million slaves who have not been formally educated in any way? How do you free them? Should there be compensation for slave owners? That was another question. Should be, because they were viewed as price, should they be compensated? And if they're not compensated, then what's the incentive, for at least for some of them, to free their slaves? That was a problem. And then if you free them, where do the slaves go? Do you expect them to stay? Do you expect them to become neighbors? Right? And the real fear that Jefferson foresaw was a race war. And Jefferson said, in a race war between whites and blacks, justice is on the side of the freed slaves. But our self-interest to stay alive will force us, to fight and kill. So what do we do? Now, in the end, I think Jefferson and the other founding fathers believed that slavery would die a natural death. And up until the 1790s, I think there was some cause to believe that slavery was a dying institution. Of course, the invention of the cotton gin changed that. But in the end, there's no question, and I do this in my book. In the end, we have to morally judge and condemn those American revolutionaries who were slaveholders who did not free their slaves. I think we have a moral obligation to do that, and I can put it in the form of a question. I can put this moral issue in the form of a question. Consider the following hypothetical. One of Thomas Jefferson's slaves escapes and spends 2 days traipsing through the Virginia forest and swamps, trying to get to the north, trying to get to freedom. Thomas Jefferson follows him on horseback. And after 2 days, Jefferson tracks him down, and these two men are now standing face to face in the middle of a forest. And it's just the two of them. Does this runaway slave have a moral right to kill Thomas Jefferson? And the answer has to be yes.
Yes. Yeah.
Right? That's a hard pill to swallow. To think that a runaway slave could kill the author of the Declaration of Independence. Right? But in the end, I think that is, that is the great tragedy of American history.
Yes. Yes. Absolutely. And I also like your point that considering all of this, I mean, given all of this, still Declaration of Independence is the founding document for the abolitionist movement. Because once you establish the principle, there is a movement towards increase of freedom, not only in America, but throughout the world, because it is establishing something which is foundational for civilization itself. It's a it's a statement of it identifies the nature of human beings. And so over time, it spreads. The freedom spreads.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. And I don't like to speak of the Declaration's truths as a virus, but it is kind of, I mean, the equality truth and the rights truth of the Declaration is a kind of, good virus, right? That once it's unleashed on the world, because in my view, these two truths are in fact true, and they provide, and they're true because they're grounded in human nature. And once these principles have been enunciated and declared to the world, they take on a life of their own. And that's what they did. They took on a life of their own and became a force. They became a force for good, a force for justice, and a force for freedom.
Wonderful. Shall we go to the next one, which is the consent, or do you want to focus on rights? How do you want to do this?
Well, let me just, I mean, in many ways, rights is the most important
Mhm.
of the truths. But in a sense, I've already spoken
Mhm.
of rights in what I think is the most important way, which is to contrast it with the idea of the rights of Englishmen, right? So the most important thing to understand about the Declaration's understanding of rights is that these rights are grounded in nature, in man's nature, in human nature,
Mhm.
which means that they are and should be interpreted as absolute, permanent, and universal, right? And they are such because, I mean, what makes rights natural? What makes rights natural, I think, is that they are a kind of necessary and objective requirement of human life, of human flourishing. And they provide a standard. They provide a standard of proper moral action that all of us can live by. And the concept of rights, I mean, you can think about it in a twofold way. Rights, on the one hand, are a kind of a license. It's a license to act, to to um, to act on one's natural liberty. But on the other hand, the flip side, rights are also like a fence, a barrier that is around us, that protects us from other individuals. So the concept of rights has, I think, for the founders at least, has a kind of twofold quality. But it's the important thing is that the concept of rights is grounded in nature, and it's so you can think about it in these terms. Rights are important because they are it is a necessity and a right that man should be free to choose and pursue his own values. It's necessary and right to freely exercise his rational faculty. It's necessary and right to keep, acquire, use, trade one's property. And it's necessary and right that each of us should benefit or suffer from the consequences of our actions, right? So that's, I think, the most important thing to say about the Declaration's doctrine of rights. And I'll just say one last thing about
Sure.
rights, and more particularly about the pursuit of happiness.
Mhm.
So happiness, as it was for Aristotle, and as I think it was for people like Adams and Jefferson, happiness is man's highest value, and he needs freedom to pursue that highest value. But they did not understand the pursuit of happiness to be a subjective concept. Happiness, true happiness, I mean, they understood that there was something, I mean, they used the term true happiness or real happiness as opposed to false happiness. I mean, there are all kinds of, you may be happy when you first sit down to eat an entire box of chocolates, but the second you're finished that box of chocolates, then all of a sudden you're sick. So you've not pursued your ultimate happiness because you're no longer happy. Here's the point. Happiness was the end, but virtue was the means. So they saw an important connection between moral virtue and happiness, and that there are certain virtues that one must act out in one's life in order ultimately to achieve happiness. So again, it's not this kind of floating abstraction. It's not subjective. There is a real kind of happiness that one that and a kind of long-term and permanent happiness that one can achieve, but it does require moral virtue in order to achieve it.
So this concept is it similar to Aristotle's concept of eudaimonia, where you're saying you're actually referring not to a emotion, but a state of being, a flourishing state of being where everything in your life is doing well, and being virtuous is a means to be doing that.
Yes,
Okay.
yes, without question. So Thomas Jefferson once said that the four intellectual influences on the Declaration of Independence were Aristotle, Cicero, Locke, and Sidney. Of those four, Aristotle, Cicero, and Locke were philosophers of happiness. All of them understood that happiness was the end of life. And I'm not saying that's not true of Sidney. It's just that he didn't write about that. But yeah, so happiness is a kind of permanent state of mind or a long-term state of mind, and it's connected to an overall understanding of eudaimonia or human flourishing.
So you want to talk about the other two, consent and revolution?
Yep. All right. So let me just read this third self-evident truth: that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. All right. You'll notice in the logical order of the Declaration's four truths, they go from the genuinely self-evident. So, I mean, of the four self-evident truths, I think maybe equality is the only one that you could say is truly self-evident. Maybe rights, but certainly by the time you get to the third and fourth self-evident truths, these are not self-evident in the way we traditionally have understood the concept of self-evident. These are complex truths. So let me give you an example of how complex the third self-evident truth is. All right, it says that to secure again, let me just read it again, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. All right, now parse that sentence, not even a sentence, parse the clause, that to secure these rights, full stop. That suggests that the purpose of government is to secure these rights, the rights identified in the second self-evident truth. Now, if the sole purpose of government is to protect rights, and the Declaration says there is no other purpose than the protection of rights, the Declaration of Independence does not say that the purpose of government is to promote virtue or to create or to promote the common good. It says that to secure these rights, that's the purpose of government. Now, if the purpose of government is to secure these rights, that implies a certain kind of government. It implies a limited government, the sole purpose of which is the protection of rights. Mm-hmm. Continuing, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. Governments are instituted among men. That suggests that government is not natural as it was, say, for Aristotle and for the Tories of that time, and for a long-standing tradition of conservative political thinkers who would argue that, as Aristotle put it, the polis, the city-state, is natural. Jefferson and the founders are saying that government is not natural. It's an artificial creation, right? And it also implied in what Jefferson has written here is that there was a time before there was government. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. That implies that men lived in society before they created government. And he's getting this idea from Locke's second treatise. And what is that society? It's what Locke called the state of nature. Men lived in a state of nature, but the problem with the state of nature is that man's rights in the state of nature are insecure. And they're insecure largely because some men are non-rational, and because even the best of men are not good judges in their own case or in their own cause, right? So you need an independent, neutral, hopefully objective third party to adjudicate disputes between individuals in a state of nature. And that becomes the government. And then just to end the clause, it says, deriving their just powers from the consent of the government, of the governed, which means that when individuals leave the state of nature, there must be unanimous consent by all individuals in that society to agree to the creation of government, to the creation of a government, the sole purpose of which is the protection of rights. And at the heart of it is consent. Each individual has to give his or her consent. Why? Because each and every individual is a self-owning, self-governing, self-reliant individual. And which means they're all equal. What it means is that no man is by nature the ruler of another, and no man is by nature the slave of another. Right? So that's a complex, the third truth is complex, and it's made up of several components that actually are chronological. But I think the core concept there is consent. All right, finally, revolution, the revolution truth, which is the most complex. It said, the Declaration says that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute no new government, laying its foundations on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. All right, let's parse that clause, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends. Now, that's interesting when it says any form of government. So that means any form of government may be destructive of the end of government, which is the protection of rights. So implied in that is the idea that republics, what they would have thought as the best form of government, could likewise be a tyrannical government. But on the flip side, if it turns out that any form of government can be destructive of those ends, it's probably also likely the case that any form of government or many forms of government, not just a republic, could be a protector of rights. So that's interesting because that suggests, for instance, that you could have a monarchy. Theoretically, you could have a monarchy, maybe not over long periods of time, not over hundreds of years, but I think it is certainly theoretically possible that you could have a monarchical form of government or an aristocracy that could be protective of the ends of government, namely man's rights. All right, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it. Stop right there. The people have a right to alter or abolish it. That is a tyrannical government. Now, what that means, that's that draws upon the third self-evident truth, which is consent. In other words, what it's saying is that the consent, that the people may consent to withdraw their support for a government. And when they withdraw their consent, which is what they did in 1776, that means the government is no longer legitimate once the people have withdrawn their consent. And then, but then there's a positive sense in which the word consent is being used. Continuing, and to institute new government, laying its foundations on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. What that means is that the people, so you have to rely on the people's consent to overturn a government, but you also have to rely on the people's consent to create a new government, right? So consent is at the heart of this government, and at the heart of consent is the doctrine of rights, and at the heart of the doctrine of rights is the metaphysical claim that all men are created equal.
Wow. Wow.
All right. But here's where it gets. Oh, there's so much more. Here's where it gets really interesting. So what is this right to revolution? Right? So can the people invoke the right of revolution whenever they want? Right? So everybody in this chat room right now knows that Shrikant is a crazy tax rebel, and that he's ready to move to the mountains of Idaho so he doesn't have to pay taxes anymore. And then one day, Mr. Government comes knocking on Shrikant's door, and Shrikant opens the door with a double-barrel shotgun and says, "Over my dead body, do you take 1 penny for your new tax on soda pop?" Right? Is that what the Declaration means by the right to revolution? That every time Shrikant doesn't like some act that's being passed by the government, that he can exercise his right to revolution? No, that's not what the Declaration means. That's not what the revolution truth means. Consider the next sentence. Notice that the first word of the next sentence is prudence. Prudence indeed will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes. And accordingly, all experience hath shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. But, and here's the key, the but is important, but when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. All right, so what does that mean? So every time Shrikant doesn't like some new tax that's being passed by the government, he doesn't have the right to revolution, nor is it prudent, because it's just Shrikant and his rifle. And it turns out the government has many more guns and much bigger guns than Shrikant has, right? So prudence dictates that you don't rebel whenever you feel like it. What is required, according to the Declaration, is an identifiably objective design, that's the Declaration's word, or pattern, indicating that the movement of this particular government is towards tyranny. So think about it in these terms. Was revolution justified in 1765 with the passage of the Stamp Act? The answer is no. I mean, by Jefferson's standard, I think the answer is no. because there was no design in 1765 to enslave them. The fact of the matter is, that over the course of the previous 4 decades, every now and then, every 10, every 20 years, yeah, sure, Parliament passed an act that, by the standard or principles of the Declaration, might have been unjust. But Jefferson's point here is that a one-off law does not indicate a design to enslave or a design to institute a tyranny over the people. What's required is an objectively identifiable pattern. So, Sugar Act, Stamp Act, Declaratory Act, Townsend Acts, Tea Act, Coercive Acts, Prohibitory Act, all passed within a 10-year period, indicates to Jefferson that there was a design to enslave the Americans. And therefore, in 1776, revolution was justified, but would not have been justified in 1765.
Wow. Brad, this is incredibly good. This is just amazing.